Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the True North Report. My name is Andrew Lawton, a fellow with True North, just returning a couple of days ago to Canadian soil after covering the first ever global conference for media freedom in the United Kingdom. And this was a coverage opportunity that ended up being a very significant one. We were only able to, as an organization, cover it as effectively as we did because of your support. So I want to begin, before I get into all the meat and the nitty-gritty of this topic, with a thank you to all of those of you who donated to the crowdfunding campaign. It was a very pricey endeavor, but an important one, because in a lot of cases, governments try to bring all of the things that they're going to be talking about when it comes to how they're going to surrender regulation to these global interests. They bring them to these corners of the world so that no one can really cover them and hold them accountable. So it was important to be there. We raised all the money. We exceeded the goal slightly, covered it, and I'm very glad we did, and I'll talk about why in the next couple of moments. But first, hello. Hope you're enjoying the heat of the summer, depending on where you are in Canada. I'm pretty sure everywhere is getting at least a bit of heat, maybe not as swelteringly so as we are here in Southern Ontario. But I can't complain. It was pretty bad in the UK as well. The idea that we had gone for, I just want to preface this, was because free speech is an important issue in Canada. Free speech is an important issue. Media freedom, press freedom, freedom of expression, all of these issues I really put under that one umbrella of freedom of speech. And when the Canadian government announced some months ago it was going to be co-hosting a media freedom conference, I think it took me all of about a day to really decide with our team, okay, are we going to do this? And everyone said yes. It's just a matter of how do we raise the money to do it. But the reason I think this is an important topic is because I've been discussing free speech issues for years. I mean, this has always been one of the biggest things that I've tried to bring up, because on the political battles that we see day to day, freedom of speech is really the mother of all freedoms in so many regards. If you don't have the right to speak out about issues, you lose the right to advance any solutions on these issues. And press freedom, I've always said, is very much in alignment with the broader idea of free speech. But what was fascinating about this conference is that no one actually wanted to talk about free speech. No one at this conference actually wanted to have a discussion about freedom of opinion, about freedom of expression, about freedom of speech. They only wanted to talk about journalists in the third world. Now, believe me when I say this is a legitimate discussion to have. You look at a journalist in Malta not too long ago, which is a developed, relatively well-to-do, tiny nation in Europe. A journalist was killed by a car bomb, and there's been virtually no investigation into it by the government, a government that she was reporting on. There was one gentleman who was at the Global Conference for Media Freedom from Ghana. He was speaking, but he legitimately had to cover his face. He looked like Cousin It. He had to cover his face because he would be killed if his identity was known. There was another woman there who has been a reporter in Venezuela. She has stuck so much in the craw of the powers that be, the dictatorship in Venezuela, that they won't even give her a new passport. So she's in many respects exiled from her own country, although she doesn't feel it would be safe to go back anyway. So it's no harm, no foul in some respects. So there are legitimate examples around the world where journalists are facing persecution that simply doesn't exist in the West. These are all important issues to discuss. So I'm not trying to say they're not. I'm not identifying a problem without saying we should talk about a solution. We should talk about a solution. But you have to look at media freedom in the broad spectrum. You have on one end all of these cases I was just talking about, and on the other end you have situations in Western developed democratic countries like Canada and the UK where free speech rights are not protected by the government on the day-to-day. And that was the reason I wanted to go to this. But the Canadian government, the British government, neither of them was interested in talking about the issues that exist in their own countries. And these are the two countries that were hosting this conference in London, England. And I want to go through a few of the examples of how this conference ended up being simply about window dressing, and how the discussions of free speech and media freedom didn't exactly transition at all into an embrace of those freedoms. And a few of these things you may have seen by now. I was doing videos nonstop. I was writing columns. We were publishing a lot of content on this. But I want to put it all into one narrative here so that people can understand exactly what's going down. And this is a 2-day conference. It's a 2-day conference. It was a global affair. All of the delegates were from either governments or from various NGOs. You had NGOs that are doing fact-checking projects, or NGOs that are doing work to try to give journalists legal defense, or other things like this. But that in and of itself is, I think, one of the problems here. All of these groups were effectively saying the same thing. All of the groups were liberal in nature, it seemed, and pretty much all of their contributions to this was about what can government do. And you always have to be very concerned when that's the premise of a discussion. What can government do? For example, one of the panels was titled, "What can government do about media sustainability?" And if you listen to the panel, it was all about bailouts. Everyone was saying the government needs to bail out the media industry. There was one session about public media, so public broadcasters like BBC or CBC. That session was, again, based on the premise the government has to do more to protect and preserve and uphold public broadcasting. So on the things that were focused on the business of journalism, there was this overwhelming sense from the panels and the discussion groups and the conference sessions that government needs to do more. That was their answer. And if you look a little bit beneath the surface, you realize that government's already doing plenty. In fact, government giving money to the media is only going to diminish press freedom rather than enhance it. And let's just take a look at what's happening in Canada right now. You've got $1.3 billion a year that the federal government gives CBC. You've also got just shy of $600 million as a bailout that the government has put to the media sector. Now, of that $600 million, we don't yet know entirely how much is going to go to which outlet or what the checks and balances are going to be. But the one thing we have seen in the last several months in Canada is that the existence of that money, the fact that that $600 million exists, has eradicated, or at the very least eroded, the trust that Canadians have in the media. Because now the default response, if you see a story, is, oh, well, hang on, is this just bought and paid for media? And I think a lot of that is a knee-jerk reaction. I think in some cases you can write a news story that has a favorable position about the Liberals without being bought and paid for. You may disagree, but my position there is that a lot of the people in the media simply have a liberal bias. They simply have a liberal bias. So it's not entirely out of the ordinary that they may write a favorable story about the Liberals, but that money changing hands has caused Canadians, and I'd say discerning Canadians, to question the motivation and background of every single story that comes out. So if you want to say that public trust erosion with regard to the media is threatening the media, government putting money into the media sector to prop up an industry that in an economic sense anyway is on its way down is not going to be the solution. It's going to only exacerbate these problems further. So that's one of the key issues that comes up. But this entire conference was based on what can government do? But then we bring it to the actual free speech or press freedom questions. And I mentioned earlier, and it was one of the most disappointing parts of this, that no one at the conference actually wanted to talk about media freedom in Canada or in the UK. Or in the UK. So where do we go as Canadians from here? Where do we go as Canadians from here? My belief wholeheartedly, is that we are going to be moving towards an era where there are two types of journalism. You've got the government-approved journalism, and you've got the renegades that are outside of the system. And this is not an original thought on my part. Ezra Levant has made this point in a different sense, but I agree with his conclusion on this. But, you know, there was a bit of a selling point that things might not be as bad as I think. And if you may have seen this go around Twitter, at the conference, and this is also an indication of how hypocritical Chrystia Freeland, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Canada, was. So she was effectively inaccessible for the entirety of the conference. She wasn't doing interviews. She wasn't taking questions at her press conferences, with one exception that I'll get to in a moment. And her office was very coy and cagey about when or if she would be doing what's known as a scrum, which is when, you know, all the journalists surround the minister and ask her questions, and she theoretically gives answers. So at a certain point, we finally got an acknowledgement that, yes, Chrystia Freeland is going to do a media scrum at 1 p.m. on Thursday. And if anyone wants to cover Chrystia Freeland's media scrum, what you have to do is go and register and then show up. So I did. I registered. Now, keep in mind, I'm an accredited journalist at that event, which means that I've submitted my passport. I've had to get a passport photo taken. I have done all of the processes required of me by the British Foreign Office, and I've been given I should have brought it to use as a prop in the show today, but I was given a printed card that had my photo on it, that had my identification, my outlet, where I'm from, all of that. So I have been accredited, and I have gone through security, and by the time I'm at this conference, I have been vetted by 2 governments, conceivably. So when I say register, I mean just say, hey, I'm going to be there. So which is what I do. I tell Chrystia Freeland's press secretary, yes, I'm going to be covering the press conference. And then what happens is all of the journalists that are going to cover this scrum, mostly from Canada, a couple from the UK, are there. And Minister Freeland starts to lay the groundwork that maybe, just maybe, things are not going to go too smoothly. The press secretary starts talking about, oh, it's a small room, you know, I got to find out how many numbers there are. And she comes and she counts people and says, oh yeah, it's a small room, we might need to lose 1 or 2. And what was interesting is she said we might need to lose 1 or 2 people. There are maybe 9, I'll say 9 of us, 9 or 10 of us total, with cameramen, producers, journalists, all of these other people. And I'm thinking, all right, this is a little bit odd, but you know, I don't want to put the cart before the horse. And then what happened is 2 more people came. 2 more people from another outlet. I believe it was CBC. Don't quote me on that part, but 2 more people from another outlet came. And Chrystia Freeland's press secretary comes back, sees the group has expanded, and still says, I think we have 1 or 2 too many people. So this shows that it's not actually about the number. The number is irrelevant. It's that they are trying to get rid of 2 specific people. 2 specific people. And it will become very apparent in a moment who those were, because I was one of them. So she goes again, comes back, and says, all right, the following outlets come with me. And she lists the usual suspects: CBC, CTV, Global, The National. Now, this is not the Canadian National. This is a British outlet called The National, Al Jazeera English, follow me. And in that moment, journalists took a stand for journalist freedom. Mainstream media journalists took a stand for journalist freedom, because there were 2 outlets that had registered, that were waiting patiently, accredited at the conference, that were not invited on that list to go to the scrum. One of them was True North, and the other was The Rebel. Sheila Gunn Reid and Ezra Levant were there, although at this particular moment, it was just Sheila Gunn Reid that was going to be covering the conference. And Sheila and I were the only 2 journalists excluded from this list. And the rest of them stood their ground. Global, CTV, Al Jazeera English, Globe and Mail, CBC as well, and said, well, hang on, no, we are not going unless everyone goes. And they stood firm, and you could tell that the press secretary was baffled. She did not expect it to go this way. She expected that no one would complain, because no one would stand up for conservative media. Because that's the minister's position on this. That's Chrystia Freeland's office's position on this, that conservative media is not real media. And I bet you that if National Observer or Rabble had been there, this issue wouldn't have happened. They would have been waltzed right in and given the red carpet treatment. But the mainstream media stood up for... No, I don't even want to say they stood up for me. They stood up for my right as a journalist, as an accredited journalist, to cover it. But they stood up for principles more than they stood up for me individually. And I think that's so important, because they recognize that at a media freedom conference, the government does not have the right to pick and choose by hand who gets to cover a press scrum. So again, Freeland's office scurries away, comes back and says, oh, we found a bigger room. Why don't you come with me? Now, this was, I believe, entirely orchestrated in advance. And there are 2 reasons for this. Number one, the story I just told you about the 1 or 2 too many people, but even when the group expanded, it was still 1 or 2 people too many. The other is that this is a 16-acre facility. I looked it up after. I didn't measure by hand there. This is a 16-acre facility that has concerts with an audience of over 5,000 people. This conference had about 1,500. So the idea that there was no room at what was a giant warehouse, a converted warehouse, is absolutely false. There was room everywhere. In fact, the place that we were all standing and waiting for her to come back and bring us to the scrum was a room we could have done the scrum in. Like, she could have just brought Chrystia Freeland to this area. We could have done the scrum, and that would have happened. So what ended up going down is we all went there. We set up. We had the cameras poised. Chrystia Freeland came out. Everyone asked a question each, no follow-ups, and the world didn't end. That's the thing about free speech. The world does not end when you allow the free exchange of ideas. The world does not end when you allow open discourse, when you allow free speech, when you allow free thought. If anything, people only get smarter. I got to ask my question, which was about a story I'll talk about in a moment. Chrystia Freeland got to give her answer. To her credit, she gave a clear answer. I didn't agree with it. I didn't like it. I still think there's a hypocrisy, but she answered it, and that is the free exchange of ideas. And this was only made possible because the mainstream media, reporters in attendance, said no when they saw that the government was trying to block its critics from covering it. And again, I do not compare the experiences of people in the media in Canada to those of the third world. I'm not saying that I, as a member of the media critical of the government, have to fear for my life in this country. I don't. But there is a common thread between what you see in dictatorships and what Chrystia Freeland tried to do, which is to say, you are critical of us, you do not have the right to cover this government. The Russian government legitimately does that. The Russian government will say, you will not get credentials because we don't like your coverage. And remember that I was approved. I was accredited. I didn't just walk in off the street as a blogger and say I'd like to cover this, although even then I think they should let me in unless I'm being disruptive. I was approved, accredited, had gone through security, had no intention of causing a disruption, and I then eventually had the right to ask a question of a minister who represents me, a minister who's representing Canada abroad at this summit. But the question that I asked was another example of hypocrisy in this conference. So again, you have the tone of this, that the Canadian and British governments are trying to tell the world about press freedom. And it comes across as very gloaty because they're saying we've done all of this right and everyone else needs to follow along and fall in line on it. But at the second day of the conference, Chrystia Freeland was on stage along with Jeremy Hunt, who's her counterpart in the United Kingdom and potentially the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, although I think Boris Johnson's going to take it. But the two of them were up on stage, and Jeremy Hunt decided to give accolades to a man by the name of Gobind Singh Dale. Now, Gobind Singh Dale might not be a household name in Canada, but it's a name that you should know because he is the Malaysian Minister of Communications and Multimedia. Now, you may not have realized there was a communications and multimedia ministry, let alone one in Malaysia, but there is. And the man who occupies that post is Gobind Singh Dale. He was held up, took the stage with Chrystia Freeland and Jeremy Hunt, and held up by Jeremy Front as being something of a pioneer, a man fighting on the front lines for press freedom, and doing so in Malaysia from his post as a government minister. Now, I do not associate typically Malaysia with being the bastion of free thought and free speech. It's just not the first country that I think of. So what I did is I decided to do some digging, not just into the Malaysia free speech issue, but into this particular minister himself. And what I found was legitimately shocking. This is a man who in September, so less than a year ago, so how long is that, 9 months ago, called for the government of his country, Malaysia, to introduce legislation that would make it not just illegal to write something online that the Malaysian government disapproves of, but they wanted to ensure what they called extraterritorial prosecutorial powers, which means he wanted to be able to prosecute me in Canada or someone in England or someone in Norway if they say something that Malaysia views as being hate speech. And what the story that triggered this call for legislation was is that a publisher in London, England, a publisher in London, England, decided to make an offensive crack about a Sikh police chief's turban in Malaysia. And he said, I think his turban's on too tight. And this was held up not just as hate speech by Gobind Singh Deo, but hate speech that should be allowed to be prosecuted hemispheres away. That the Malaysian government should prosecute this guy in England for making a comment about a Malaysian guy's turban. This is something that was so significantly dangerous that this man, who is actually a state censor, a guy who's actually a state censor, was sharing the stage with Canada and the UK, their foreign ministers, at a media freedom summit, or what was supposed to be a media freedom summit. And it goes on beyond that. He also, in March, just a couple of months ago, had called for legislation that would be allowing the prosecution of social media companies or any digital media companies to hold them accountable for what people comment on. And one of the examples given was that if someone were to comment on the True North news stories that we do, and the government doesn't like the comments, that True North could be prosecuted because we invited or incited these comments. So here's a man who takes a restrictive, dictatorial view about free speech and media freedom, who is not just invited to attend and listen and maybe learn something, but who is on stage being honored at what is, again, supposed to be the Media Freedom Conference. And this wasn't the only example of a state censor that's been elevated in this position. Pakistan's foreign minister was also there, and you may have seen the video of Ezra Levant heckling him, a video that, by the way, was very well received in India, where India, which is a freedom-loving nation and very quickly becoming a global superpower, was baffled that Pakistan's foreign minister, a man with, I would say, a man whose government has blood on its hands, and he was given a speaking spot at the Media Freedom Conference. And when I put this to Chrystia Freeland, eventually, I was only able to, because I finally got into that scrum, her answer was that this is not a conference for angels. Which, look, I mean, truer words have never been spoken. This is certainly not a conference for angels. But her belief is that, well, you know, we just got to bring everyone to the table on this. So what you have is a government in Canada that's not prepared to look at free speech in its own country, that is inviting people that are fundamentally against free speech and holding them up as heroes, a government that is not allowing critical media outlets, but fair and respectful. And I think that's important. I've interviewed Justin Trudeau. I've interviewed Liberal cabinet ministers. I've now asked Chrystia Freeland a question at a media scrum. I am not the boogeyman. I'm not scary. You know, I'm a very fair and respectful person. I respect the offices. And in fact, when I interviewed Trudeau, I was getting criticized because I wasn't yelling at him. I was getting criticized because I was not, you know, shouting. People thought that I needed to be angry at him. I said, no, just let me ask the questions. Let the words themselves illuminate. And, you know, you're going to hear a couple of interviews that I did with people later on this week. They're going to be coming out. And in these interviews, I'm just trying to get a sense of what it is they believe. And one of them is a Reporters Without Borders spokesperson, and the other is someone who's a representative of an organization for public broadcasters. And they're very convivial, congenial interviews, because I'm not looking to sink these people. I know we're never going to agree. What I want is for their ideas to be heard so that we can criticize them and have an honest debate about them. And that is what media freedom is supposed to be about. That's what media freedom is supposed to be about. And the Canadian government either does not know that or does not care about that. And, you know, I want to explain a little bit about the conference itself here, but I want to read a comment from, well, the comment section here. Nancy writes, keep going. It's so important to hear other sides. Don't let them control media in their favor. And thanks to the other media for being principled, even when Freeland was not. I think that's a great thought you share there, Nancy, and it's so important because if the mainstream media hadn't spoken up, and they did, and I'm glad they did, and I have a lot of respect for the individual people there, but if the mainstream media reporters present hadn't spoken up, they would have been tacitly endorsing the government doing the same thing down the line to them. Look at the Globe and Mail. The Globe and Mail had a gentleman there, very nice guy. The Globe and Mail was the outlet that wrote the story about SNC-Lavalin, that initial story of Jody Wilson-Raybould having been pressured on the SNC-Lavalin file. What would happen if Justin Trudeau were to say, every reporter who's here, come on in, I'm going to do questions from the media except the Globe and Mail? What if he said that? Then all of a sudden, Justin Trudeau would be saying, I only allow access to outlets whose coverage I personally like. And that is the death knell for a free press, when access is contingent on the favorability or lack thereof of your coverage. But what was interesting is that access was literally the last priority. It was the lowest priority at this conference. And I'll explain why. Because it was one giant 16-acre facility, but within the facility there were two sides. There was the general conference area and all the event rooms and the session rooms and all of that. And then there was this parallel space. And what was so fascinating about this space is that it was an entire charade. Everything about the Global Media Freedom Conference was choreographed. It was orchestrated. Everything about the Global Conference for Media Freedom was orchestrated. Even the arrival of people to the venue. The way that everyone came in was different from the place that the VIPs came in. And if you look on the Flickr page of the Foreign Office in Britain, they actually show pictures of people arriving to the venue. And these are all staged, because where they're coming was not actually a publicly accessible area. They're showing up and doing this great greeting, even though they're literally a building apart. They're on the other side of the building from the media that were there to cover it. The rooms where the government leaders and the delegations were doing their meetings in were closed off to the press. I was actually kicked out of a conference room where one of the most consequential events of the conference was taking place because it was closed off to the press. And this conference room was where government delegations were going to be discussing how they're going to implement the things that are discussed during the course of the conference. There were delegate lunchrooms, delegate waiting rooms, delegate hallways, delegate boardrooms, delegate meeting rooms, all of these things that were to keep a literal wall and security between government politicians and the media. This is at a media freedom conference. This is Stalinistic, and this is entirely North Korea-like, to see fake photos of fake media availabilities, of fake mingling sessions, all because you don't want to actually allow the press that you're supposed to be standing up for the freedoms of to be near the politicians that are making the determinations and supposedly going to be enforcing and bolstering freedom when they go back home after this conference. And it was seeing that I would not have been able to have gleaned had I just watched what was happening in the official session through the official camera from the comfort of my own home. So it was important to be there. It was important to be there to witness firsthand the government hypocrisy. It was important to be there to put that question to Chrystia Freeland. It was important to be there to call the governments hosting this thing to account for making such an unfree event, even though they're trying to pretend that they have this sort of moral high ground. So I was glad to have been there, and I want to thank you very much for your support in making this happen. True North donors or True North Nation made this happen. If you want to donate to further the efforts that we're doing to stand up for free speech, you can do so by heading on over to tnc.news, clicking on donate. We'll have more as the week progresses, though, folks. Thank you, God bless, and good day, Canada.